that Saturday Evening Post made up from their research about 1950. And so they came up with a figure. Now you stop and think, you don't need to yell out the numbers or anything, but what do you think? 200, 500, 800, 1,000, 3,000?
I'm gonna go with 500.
What do you think?
500.
Anyway, think about it. Okay, we'll put this chart out later, but keep in mind, this is from research they did about 1950. Okay, the figure that they came up with was 2,726 makes of cars. Now, some of these are repeated, and some of them are ones that were developed by somebody and then they didn't sell successfully, so they dropped it. Somebody else bought the makings and so on, and some of them were brand new, just use of that same name, but they were all different names. And so you'll be able to look at this, and then there's some little advertising from the Post too, but that just coordinated kind of well with this.
You're going to put it out there in the break.
So we'll put it on a table back there or something so you can't see it. But then another thing to stop and think about before we dive in here is where do the names come from? Well, obviously, most of you know that a lot of them came from the developer of the car itself. And this was very common, obviously. And other things where the names came from, perhaps the town where they were developed, Auburn, for Auburn, Indiana, for instance. Maybe the cars were named after some thing to do with American history, maybe like Pontiac, an Indian chief, or DeSoto, an explorer. And there were ways that they named cars too, perhaps about some characteristic that they wanted to emphasize that the car excelled in, and like Sterling or Regal or something like this. So just think about those little things. And we'll dive into this. Most of it, as you see, is on the nameplates and the hubcaps. And we inserted a few other little things into, and I think we were looking earlier, I think you'll be able to see the printing fairly well, even in the back, because there's several things on each slide, in some cases, about some of these makes. Now, when you think of it, it's kind of like a drop in the bucket as far as all these makes were concerned, but it's enough of these. And Daryl put it together in such a way so that if he found a hubcap and a nameplate and an ad, then he put it all on that slide. And then if it was related to another car that was made by the same company, the next slide goes to that. So I think you'll see some sense to it as we go along. So we can dive in now, I think.
Give me a second here. Yeah, I'm gonna get it lined up right.
Can you go on then to
I will.
the next one?
See if I can do it. I gotta stop it and start.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. All right. I need that one.
No, we don't.
Do the
need
best
that
you can. Well, that's what we're going to try.
That one. And the fire ears up again.
Just go to number 2 then. They're all numbered, so.
Hang on. There it is. Yeah.
No.
It's coming. Got it loaded. I had to reload it. Sorry.
That's all right.
All right, and then we're gonna go to the next one. There we go. I'm on it.
We'll illustrate a variety of nameplates and hubcaps. All the porcelain items, all the hubcaps, and all the nameplates are our personal collection. And I photographed them. And that's the Studebaker one. And we'll talk more about Studebaker later when we get to the Studebaker slide. Okay.
Just a little background information, which you can see there. They often had very colorful nameplates, and the radiator shells use the nameplate, and they put it on the top portion. And then the hubcaps, of course, were a reason to have them was to protect the spindle and the axle and so on. And they started out with plain ones with a lot of companies, but then they thought, well, might as well do a little advertising here. So they would carry the name of the company or the model, and then maybe something pretty fancy, or maybe quite plain, as you will see some of these hubcaps are.
Yeah, not all companies put their name on the hubcaps, and we have about 15 nice brass early hubcaps with no name on them. And just an interesting side note, when I was 14 years old and out in Colorado, out in the boondocks, there was a Stanley steamer chassis. And I asked about it, and he said, "Oh, it's just junk, you can have what you want." So I took the hubcap off, and it didn't say Stanley, and a couple of little items. Okay, go to about 4 years ago, and Gary Hoosman was restoring a Stanley. And I said, "Well, I have a hubcap off one that I got out of Colorado." And he said, "Did it come up northern part of Colorado?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, that car is in Golden, Colorado at the present time and being restored." And so I gave him the hubcap, and he sent it out to the owner. And after 70 some years, the hubcap went back on the same chassis. It's interesting. Okay, we go. What white one? These are clubs, and as you see, a lot of clubs are formed around the country of owners, and these are some from our collection. I have more around somewhere. And it's just interesting. A lot of them in California was very popular in the early days in automobiles and farming clubs. Locally, of course, you had the AAA, the Automobile Club of America. And it's interesting. I have the 1910 roster of the members, which is interesting. And so, but I used to put them on the front of my 1910 radiator. Then I wondered why the car boiled all the time, and so then I took them off.
The one on the right that doesn't quite show up, that's for a Chicago car club, as I remember.
Yeah.
It's a little plainer than all these enameled ones.
And the AAA one up there is a porcelain sign, a real nice one, about 25, 2 feet wide, and perfect. And we have that on a rail on our deck. This is the Regal automobile. The Regal was an underslung, and that's the original hubcap up there for one. There weren't that many made, but I have a nameplate off of one and the hubcap, but it was an underslung. And there are a few around. Somebody was restoring one a few years ago and wanted to buy a nameplate, but I haven't given it up yet. I suppose I should, but it's interesting. This is, as you see, it's in Detroit.
And as we go through these, you'll see some of these cars were in existence for quite a few years, some many years, and the few of them that we have cited here, just because we happen to have the information and the pictures and the items, are very short-term cars.
Okay. Buick, named after Dunbar Buick, and 1903. The oldest one, somebody down in the Harold Warp collection, he claimed he has the oldest Buick, but it has a Selden plate on it. The Selden plate wasn't developed in 3, it was I think 1904 or 5 when the Selden group went together, but it isn't early. It's a Model B, I think, and there was one before that. But Dunbar Buick developed the car, but Billy Durant took the company over and eventually built General Motors around it. And when they had the 25th anniversary of the Buick, they hunted up Dunbar Buick, and he was poor. And so they bought him a new suit of clothes and everything, and toured him around the country and showed him off. So at least he got a little bit out of his name.
You might want to count the number of times you see Bill Durant's name through this presentation. There must be at least 5.
Yeah.
But that's the first one.
Veely Motors, of course, Mr. Veely was a grandson of John Deere, and the Veely family had a branch up here in Minneapolis, of course. Remember Veely Olds, some of the people? Well, that's the company. And I did meet one of the family at one time, and they owned a 17 Beely. But it is interesting that that is a button, actually, not the nameplate there in Beely. That is a button that I have in our auto button collection. But that is original hubcap, so it's kind of fun to talk about that. Okay.
Here you see some information about the Dort, and originally it was William Durant and Dort that had a carriage company, and then you can see how things moved on and changed, and the company was eventually controlled by G. Dallas Dort.
Billy Durant got started selling buggies and wagons from that company, and when he formed Peter got hold of General Buick Company, he contained his ownership in that, but eventually sold out. But that's what he used. He sold so many wagons and such, he got enough money then to invest into automobile companies. And of course, there was a Flint automobile also.
And just in a couple instances, we happen to have some stock certificates. So there we had one, and we have one for another one too, which was kind of fun. Okay.
This is a famous one. Those of you who know anything about the history of advertising, this ad somewhere west of Laramie is a very famous one. If you, when at the university, in one of my advertising classes over there, they talked about that ad. That was the first ad really that sold the wind and the fun. Most of them before showed the car and said that it was 110-inch wheelbase and 40 horsepower and all that. This doesn't. This sold that somebody out in West Lady was driving and had fun with the car. And it's interesting. It's a fairly rare car. There are several Jordan Playboys in existence, but there's the original hubcap from one.
Those of you that can see the language in the ad, even if you didn't see the car there and see what it looked like, you could probably tell that this was developed like in the 1920s when the descriptions got a little more loose and so on, and probably would have been more of a staged ad if it had been from.
Well, it's similar today. Your ads on television for the automobile, they show them going down dirt roads and fast and through the mud and such. They don't tell you how big the car is or what the interior is like or the capacity of it, anything. It's get in the car and drive fast. And that's why the advertising people like this ad. It's the first time that you were selling just the fun and not the car. So we go on to the next slide.
Just some segments of the Packard's history, and very early one in the top center, more or less, and then a little later on over on the left. And unfortunately, we didn't have a really great radiator emblem, but it's enough to give you the idea, at least. When you find some of these things, they're not always in the best condition, but at least it illustrates everything that we wanted to kind of.
The Packard was developed by the Packard Electric Company, and it was in existence not too many years ago that I was born in Iowa. But the story is too that they bought the owner of Packard, but he bought a new automobile, and he thought he could build a bigger one, better one, so he built one. And then somebody else wanted to know more about the car after he had sold a few. And so he said, well, just go ask the man who owns one. He'll tell you how a good car it is. And that became their slogan. The motor meter up there I show, it has a notch. and that is a Packard meter. Why did it have a notch? Remember the donut chaser on the emblem on the one? Okay, that fit then when on the cap, that notch allowed it to fit over the stem of that. I own one complete like that, and I couldn't find it. I put it away years ago, took a nice picture of it, and somewhere west of Orono in our home is a original fine lady cap with the motor meter on it. I'll find it someday, or at least when I go and there's an estate sale, start digging through the boxes. Packard, you know, is merged with Studebaker, and the last Packard was a Studebaker with a Packard name on it, and a local man in Minneapolis, near in Excelsior, in Deep Haven, had a 58 Packard station wagon, and an odd-looking thing. It was all Packard names all over the place, a little different, but it was a Studebaker station wagon. The Hudson and the Hudson 6. Hudson was a famous car, and actually named after the man that had the Hudson department store in Detroit. And I think the first one, 1909, Maury Cobo and Eden in Minneapolis, or up there, Blaine, I think, had a 1910 Hudson, and I'm trying to think of the name. It was a sport model, and in Indiana there was the town
Shipshawana was the
there used to be a beautiful collection of Hudson items, and a man built a community center so that he could show off his collection of about 60 automobiles. It's something auctioned off and sold, but when we visited there, Maury Cobo's car was there. It's interesting. And so.
The next slide goes on from the Hudson to other makes that the corporation made. And the Essex, you see the years of that one. And the Terraplane, we're getting to a little more modern times there. And Darrell found an illustration of the type of vehicle that my dad had all the time when I was a young child. He had a 1937 Terraplane, and we lived on a small farm. And so as a result, what you could do is you could carry a whole lot of sacks of feed in that, or you could even, if you had a crate built, you could even carry a small animal like a pig or a calf or this sort of thing. So it served the purpose of it being something, instead of a pickup truck, looked a little more dressy and all that sort of thing. And this is the car that I remember really, really well. Ours was black, but otherwise the very same thing. It was just a little coupe. Yes.
Is that a coffin in that?
Is it a coffin, did you say?
Yeah.
No, it's just that pulled out like that. It looks like a coffin maybe, but it doesn't have a top.
It pulled out. Both Hudson and Terraplane had that model. And you closed it up and it just looked like a 5-window coupe. And and also her father, when he registered, he bought a new one, he registered it, he had to get a truck license, because it actually, they registered it as a truck because you could pull it out. So he could park in any truck parking back in those days. Remember, they always had special places to park in downtowns and that for trucks only. He could pull in there, and several times some patrol people asked him why he had a truck license. So I suppose he had to get out, open up the back, and pull that out, show him.
Harold?
Yeah.
Former member Roy Stoltz in our club had a 1930 or 31 coupe that had a full wall box like that.
I see.
So, and the center one then is a 29 Essex a boat tail, And the only very few of them were ever made. But Glenn Radke, who used to be a member around, if you knew him, Glenn Radke, I believe, had 2 of them. And they went to sale after he died. So.
And I think they wanted to emphasize with the name Terraplane, by the way, Terra meaning land and plane meaning a pretty peppy little car that was like a plane to go on land. So this is where some names came from and how they describe the vehicle, which is kind of
We
fun.
once had a Terraplane pickup truck and a Terraplane coupe. It was one that did not have the pull-out. And the pickup trucks are very, very rare, but I sold it years ago. And Maxwell Briscoe. Briscoe made radiators also. I believe the radiator on a 1909 Ford, the very first ones, the radiator was made by Briscoe. Also, there was a Briscoe automobile, and Tom Reese used to be around in the club, Sumner Tom. He had a Briscoe at one time. And so it's interesting. And down there too about Walter Chrysler took that in did I say, I can't see it, the Chalmers, but he formed a company. He bought the Maxwell company, and I believe Chalmers, and then formed Chrysler and brought the Chrysler out, I believe, in 24 or 25 minutes. And then, of course, the Maxwell became the Plymouth, but the very first year on the Plymouth was essentially a rebadged Maxwell. And this is interesting. Can that be brought down in size slightly?
Quick one to see if I can do that. No,
Yeah.
I'm stuck because of the
Okay,
resolution.
I have a number of these from the Chalmers Detroit company, and they're little plastic pins made back in 1910 or 9.
Only about that big, I think.
Yeah, and you pull a string and it flips it over. So the first you see who won the Sir Mac Valley trophy, and you pull that and up comes the person and the Chalmers. They're kind of nice. I have never seen any others because I think they're all probably lost and destroyed, but we have 3 of them. There's your Plymouth. And
of course, Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims. So here's an instance of naming a car after some famous American event or that type of thing. And I believe this is the kind of car that my dad had before he bought his Terraplane in 1937. At least that's one of my older cousins told me that. But my dad had mentioned it too, but he never mentioned what year it was. So I'm assuming it was probably about a 28 to 31 or thereabouts. So something is similar.
My dad had a 35 Plymouth, and he had a 38 Packard 8. And when World War II came and Packards didn't get the mileage, and so he sold the Packard and bought this nice little 35 Plymouth, and it would be called an old rose. And if some of those in the car business knew what we meant about an old rose is a perfect car. It's a car that looks new, really, and low mileage, and that was that little 35 Plymouth. It was a nice car. I have a photograph of it somewhere with 2 deer on the front bumpers. You know, that's how you brought your deer home in those days. You just slapped it over a front bumper between that and the hood. Okay. And the Oakland was made in Pontiac, Michigan. The Oakland was a big car, and the Oakland was part of General Motors from very early. And there were several early Oaklands in the Twin City area back in the 50s and 60s, and I remember them. And what do we have? I got a nameplate that's a little beat up. Some of them are, and and an Ultra hubcap. It was kind of fun back when I collected a lot of these. I was only 12, 13, 14 years old. They'd go to a scrapyard, you know, and they'd ask them if they could have the nameplates and, you know, radiators around. And I always carried a screwdriver with me and pry them off. Kind of fun.
It may surprise you a little later, you'll see when we talk about Chevrolet, that they were not an original part of General Motors, but
Yeah.
Oakland was. So
Yeah.
you'll see that later.
And then the Pontiac and the two emblems of Pontiac. And I couldn't find my Pontiac ornament. And when it came out in 1926, the radiator cap was a head of a Native American or Indian, but they mounted on it and the red or golden face. And I have one of those, but again, it's another one of these. Where is it?
We searched and searched, but it's in a box or on a shelf somewhere that's obscure, but it's still in our possession as far as we know.
Yeah, I hope to have a picture of it. And the Overland. And the Overland was original, and I have it here, that Mr. Willis bought the company, or bought control of the company in 06. But the Overland continued. The Willis didn't come in to bear to a few years later. But the Overland was a nice car. And I have a picture there of an Overland.
And the next one here, then I knew that was coming up, is about the Whippet, done by Willis Overland. And you might be interested, there's a little notebook that we have at home that Daryl's dad had kept when, and this was in 1931, this was before Daryl was ever born. And the family, there were two small children and Daryl's mother and dad. Daryl's mother and dad were still both in their 20s. So they were kind of daring to do all these things, I think. They left Montgomery, Minnesota, like about, last part of May, and traveled eastward through Washington, D.C., New York City, Niagara Falls, and back home through Canada and back home to Montgomery, Minnesota. They did it in 14 days, and, and they went through 14 states, started out with $88, and I believe he said he still had $12 left when they got home. And that was for everything that they did, they ate, everything like that. But you can imagine, it's hard to imagine people doing that. And he said at the very end, no punctures, no car trouble, no problems whatsoever. And when he got home, the daughter, who was 7, almost 8, she had her head lying on his lap. He was driving along, and all of a sudden they were home in Montgomery, and both the kids thought, oh, we thought we were going to have to stay overnight somewhere again, and here we were home, and it was 14 days. And so that was their trip. I think it's quite an entertaining story.
I believe that his Whippet was a 28, but he did also own a 32 Willis, which was a bigger car. And bought it new on a superintendent of schools salary, which in 1928 and 29 was fairly modest. Lincoln. And Lincoln is interesting, and whether I tell it there, Mr. Leland, Henry Leland, owned Leland Faulkner Company in Detroit. And in 1902, there was the Henry Ford Motor Car Company, and it was dissolved, and Henry Ford went on his own and kept the name. But the company was associated with the Detroit Automobile Company. And the Detroit Automobile Company was taken over by by the Henry Faulkner Company. And they produced a car, and they had to give it a name, so they called it Cadillac. And Henry Ford then started his company in 1903 and called it Ford. They look alike. One was a 2-cylinder and one was a 1-cylinder. The Ford was made by engine was made by the Dodge Company, and the 1-cylinder by the Leland Faulkner Company. And that's yeah, up there was the Lincoln Zephyr too. The emblem's kind of poor on the left, but that's the Lincoln Zephyr. The KB Lincolns went through 36 big engine. I had a 32 Lincoln 4-door sedan in high school. I never did get the gas tank bills, you know. But and so that's the Zephyr. And then the okay, here we are to the Franklin. You can read there what we said about the Franklin.
And early on, it was an air-cooled engine and so on, but later versions were water-cooled. And you can all tell where the 1948 Tucker is there on the right. And on the far right, notice the distinguished looks by these gentlemen to try to convey the idea that a Franklin car was something very, very special. And that's what's kind of fun about this.
It was the Franklin company when they quit making the Franklins, and I'm not sure about this as far as the car itself. Oh yeah, 34, yeah, was the last. And then when the Tucker Automobile Company was being formed, Mr. Tucker bought the aircraft engine company, which was the Franklin. And they made that 4-cylinder air-cooled for airplanes. I once had a whole bunch of material on that and sold it to a Franklin person. They were happy to find it. And so when the Tucker company went bankrupt, the only asset they really had was the Franklin company. And I don't know what happened to it after that. He altered the engine, had it redone as a water-cooled. But it was an air-cooled, of course, originally. There were 5 Tuckers in Minneapolis. There was one in Whitey's junkyard. He had a real nice Tucker. Bill Lund bought one at the auction of Lund Pressed. He had one, and there was 2 of them in Richfield. And I should have taken a picture. There was a house in Richfield that had 2 Tucker automobiles sitting. And people do remember that in 1949 at the State Fair was a red Tucker on exhibit. And for 25 cents, you could sit in it. And I remember paying my 25 cents and sitting in this Tucker automobile.
They had one on display at the Pioneer Auto Museum in Murdo, South Dakota for many, many years. It was one on display. You're nodding your head too. It's a blue one. And it's like, I looked at that one quite a bit.
The movie on Tucker, the prop man was a good friend of mine that was one of the Stoltz boys, you know, the Old Log Theater. And he did it, and when he was back a number of years ago, I asked him about it, and he said they had about 15 original Tuckers that they used. And when they did the line of all the Tuckers lined up, there were only the originals were in front, and then there were cut out, you know, ones back there that looked like Tuckers. And he said the original ones, he said they were mostly, they had to put jacks under them because some leaned one way, some leaned the other way, and they had to straighten them up so they looked like good cars. They used for the scene where the Tucker was destroyed, you know, in that they used a Studebaker, a 51 or 52 Studebaker to look like a Tucker. And so it was interesting. When they drove one, and when it was actually drove, he said they had somebody back in the back working the transmission controls because they didn't work real well, the one they were using. So when they wanted to shift, the man in the back, they told him he would shift the transmission. They used cord transmissions. There was a few automatic ones the transmissions developed. But otherwise, a local man had a nice Tucker with no transmission. He bought it real reasonable because it's one of those that the company had bought and just took the transmission and left the car. Yeah, this is unusual. I've never seen the car, but I got a hubcaps one. And it was known as the Little Aristocrat in Indianapolis. Nice hubcap. It's a big, heavy thing. Okay, here's a Chevy. You want to say anything about
Here
that?
we have Louis Chevrolet, the man who's pictured there, and you have several different emblems of Chevrolet, but they all carry the same basic idea, just as I assume that Chevrolet does today. But here we have Billy Durant popping up again, and Chevrolet did not become part of General Motors until 1919. It was a separate company.
What happened there is that, and I had he formed a little company, a little automobile company, Durant did. And I had a hubcap for one, and foolishly a few years ago, I sold it at a swap meet. And it was very rare, but he got one of the Chevrolet brothers then to build a car. So the first Chevrolet in 1911 was a big car. And then they made several until the Baby Grand was one. It was their bigger car. But what he did, he's got the DuPont family to buy stock, and the Chevrolet, through the Chevrolet company, they bought General Motors stock. And so when I think they have the year there, 1919 or 18, DuPont and Willie Durant showed up at a board meeting and took the company over. They owned more stock in that. And see, Durant lost the General Motors company in 1911. That's why he formed the Chevrolet company. He was buying too much, spending too much money, so the board bought him out, so to speak, or deal. So he just came roaring back with the Chevrolet company then. And we'll get to the Durant company eventually here, but it's interesting. Oh yeah, the EMF, every morning fix it. But there was also the Everett Metzger Flanders automobile, and the EMF was a good car. The little EMF 20 was a good automobile. There was an Everett car, and there was a Flanders car, of course. And I think Gene, trying to think of his last name, over in Old Care, Wisconsin, had an Everett 11 Everett.
And Studebaker was somewhat of an outgrowth as far as a car from the EMF there. But
what happened here is that Studebaker, of course, built the covered wagons and were very popular during the Civil War and then as such. The company, the Studebaker brothers themselves, sold out in the 1890s, 95, 96. But the Studebaker company then, in 1903 or so too, bought automobiles. It was Studebaker Garford, and it was Studebaker this and Studebaker that. And so they were in the auto business. But in 1912, I think I have the age there, they took over the EMF. So the 1912 car is called the EMF Studebaker. And there has been several around the Twin Cities. The 1913 then was called the Studebaker, but it was, I've been told it was still essentially an EMF, but just the Studebaker name then. Studebaker, unfortunately, then faded away when it merged with Packard. And it became the Studebaker Warner Company after that. The Warner Company made ice making machines for people to sell ice cubes, you know, at the service stations and that. And so that was kind of the end of it.
The Studebaker Museum is in South Bend, Indiana, and we have been there at the same time that we had been at the museum in Eastern Indiana, which is a lot of Indiana-made cars, and then a couple of very well-known large cars also. But
there's a museum in South Bend, and it's a historical society runs it. And so there's some nice Studebakers there. And when we get to Pierce Arrow, we'll talk about the connection with Studebaker and Pierce Arrow. But Studebakers are a big car. They were a nice automobile.
that is the Graham brothers on the emblem on the top middle there. In case you're wondering what it's supposed to symbolize, I think you can see them there.
And there's a connection, and it became the Graham page. There's also the Graham, and I didn't go into that. The Graham brothers also built a truck. And there's an association with the Dodge Company and the Graham truck in the late 20s. And the Page Company, of course, they merged with the Graham, and so it became Graham Page. There's and the history of that too is the company was in existence after the war, and Mr. Fraser was president of the Graham Page Company, and we merged and he associated with Kaiser, and so the Kaiser automobile and the Fraser automobile were essentially the same with different names, and it was made in the old Graham Page factory.
You think we should stop at this point?
Yeah, why don't we take a break and we'll wrap things up afterwards.
All right, take a break, we'll get back at.
And they decided that Durant had spent enough time there, and so they voted him out. But Durant, of course, owned a lot of stock and was wealthy in his own right, so he started a new company, Durant Motors. And 1922 to 32, and there's a Durant nameplate up there of ours, and then a hubcap. So Durant is responsible for a lot of the production and history of the automotive companies, and he didn't mention it there. He lived after the company. He was around, and the story was that he ended up being a manager of a bowling alley. They thought he was poor. No, he was very wealthy. What it was is he built a bowling alley, and he was going to syndicate them and have Durant bowling alleys all over the country, and it didn't quite work out. But about 15 years ago, I wasn't there that day. A man came in and bought what do you call it,
Wind vane.
a wind vane, a new one, but a perfect reproduction. And turned out his name was Durant, and they asked he was a grandson of Billy Durant. And I just wish I had met him, lived in White Bear.
So we assume he's still alive, but we don't know. We haven't kept track of him.
Yeah.
But anyway.
The Star automobile, of course, was the Durant one, and he used the Star there and such, and it was supposed to be a competitor to the Ford, and there were Stars around. I remember seeing them around in the Twin Cities at one time amongst collections.
By the way, the Star brand and also Moon, I believe, were both sold by the Mason people in Excelsior before they became a Chrysler dealership. At least that's what I always had heard, that it was the Moon and the Star, and then they went into Chrysler. And about 10, 15 years ago, the company, of course.
The Moon automobile, I think, came out of St. Louis. They also made the Diane. the Diana automobile, which was a big car. And there was a pair of them in the Wachowski's junkyard in Minneapolis, a pair of Dianas, at least one, I thought there were two. And I think he also had a couple of Pierce Arrow fire trucks. And the story is that Bill Harrah bought the Diane and the fire trucks. This is an unusual thing. I found that hubcap and I tried to research it. Where is the Falcon car? Well, it turned out to be the car went by the name of Falcon or Falcon Knight. It had a Knight engine. And the car was only for 2 years. And such. And so I did find a picture of one, but I probably got the only hubcap in existence. I don't know, but it is the original Falcon hubcap.
And obviously just coincidental that it used the name Falcon as the Ford Falcon much later did.
The Case, of course, was the Case tractor company. And yeah, the Pierce Racine company apparently, from my memory and from my research, was related to the Case automobile. And there's a few around. It's not a common car at all. And so, and in fact, it was, this is an early one because it's a brass hubcap. Brass hubcaps kind of went out around 13. Ford kept them on, you know, until later, until 16. But the Case is a good car. I remember seeing a few of them in collections at one time.
Then what you have here with International Harvester was one of the International Harvester high wheelers, and so for some time that was the type of vehicle they made. But not too many other automobiles. If you go through a lot of photos from the early days, I don't think were high wheelers.
Yeah.
This one was.
They did make a regular automobile in 1910, 9 and 10. And Robert Johnson, a friend of mine, has a 1910 International. And they made both an air-cooled and a water-cooled. And I believe his is air-cooled. And he did have to a London Brighton run at one time. And it got so hot the engine seized. So he had to take it home. And it's a rare car. I found for him an owner's manual for an international car from the same year, but the water-cooled model. But the car essentially was a similar. His car too is a convertible one. You take the back seat off and you put a box on, and then it's a little pickup. But Bob has one. The locomobile company is interesting, a little history of that. The Stanley brothers in 1898 or such developed a steam car, and they built them, and a group of people put a synergy together and bought the company. And so there's 1899, 1900, 1901 international, local steam cars around. But then they wanted to build an automobile gasoline car. So they did so and developed a gasoline automobile. And so they sold the company back to the Stanley brothers. And the Stanley brothers did quite well with it. The Stanley Hotel in Colorado, you know, is well known. And there's the back in the locomobile then. Billy Durant took in 1926 to 27, took the Durant automobile and put a name on it, the Locomobile Junior. And so it's really not a locomobile, it's a Durant automobile with the locomobile name. So the Hubmobile, that's interesting, very much so, the relationship on that. The well-known early Hubs, you could tell them coming down the road because the headlights stuck up so high. And my grandfather told me that he had in 1918, he had a 1911 Hubmobile, and he moved up to northern Minnesota, and he said he ran the car into the ditch, and a neighbor farmer came by and saw it, came over to see it, and he said, "I'll give you a bull calf for it if you don't want it." And so he took the bull calf, and the neighbor took the Hubmobile. And so it's interesting. The Graham Company and the Hubmobile Company both made a car in 1940 using the Cord body. And they were made in the Graham plant, I believe, both of them. But the Hubmobile was called the Skylark, and the Graham was, I don't remember, I should have had a picture of it. But it's well known. They say that they sold the dies for the Cord car to Japan and scrap. And somebody claimed that after World War II, and when Japan was occupied, they investigated, and those dies were still in existence. Whatever happened to them, I don't know. But it's interesting. There's the Dodge. The Dodge is an interesting one. The 1903 Ford was a Dodge, really. They made the whole chassis and delivered it. The bodies were a Wilson Company body. And the Dodge brothers made the two-cylinder engine. The Dodge brothers owned, each of them, 5% of the Ford Company. So that's where their fortune came from, 10% of the Ford Company. When Ford wasn't paying much dividends, the Dodge brothers in 1912 or so sued the company, Ford Company, and they had their lawyers, they had a code to send them to them when they settled on how much Ford was going to pay them. And the code wasn't big enough for the amount. It was a huge amount of money that they won in the lawsuit. My 1910 Ford, the engine was cast in the Dodge plant, and the steering column says Dodge Brothers on the stamped right on the steering column, and some of the front axles for 12 and 13 Fords have DB on them, Dodge Brothers. The Dodge brothers, what happened is in 1908, Ford bought a forging company so they could forge their own and started two. But it was through the last items of the Dodge name on a Ford was 1913. And 1914, late 14, they came out, the Dodge brothers, with an 8-story building they built to build the car, and Chrysler owned it later. And the 1915 Dodge was a beautiful car. A lot of them were used in World War I. They were so reliable. General Pershing had a number of 1916 Dodges. He used them in the Mexican War in 1916, but in Europe, the staff cars were Dodges. They were overbuilt, is what they were. And they both died in 1922, claiming, the family said, by the Spanish flu. But in reality, both of them died of cirrhosis of the liver. There were occasionally days when they were sober.
I can remember someone having a large, bigger than a pickup truck when I was a very young girl, and it said Dodge Brothers on the the symbolism, and I thought, Dodge Brothers, how unusual, I only heard of Dodges, you know.
Yeah.
But this one was a very old vehicle at the time.
Yeah, the family sold the company after the Dodge brothers died, and the syndicate bought it, and Chrysler bought it in about 26 or 27, and became part of the Chrysler Corporation then.
Quick question about this, is that a globe on the hubcap? Is that a globe outline, or what am I seeing here?
What is that?
Just
The-
yeah, North and
outside.
South America.
Is that? Like-
Oh, in the background, I think
Yeah.
it's just that it's worn, the hubcap is, I mean, the
That's a
emblem is
nameplate.
worn, I think that's why I don't think it's supposed to be a map particularly.
I don't think so. I didn't show a hubcap. I had all sorts of Dodge hubcaps, and I kept selling them at swap meets for $5 a piece. And unfortunately, then when I did this, I went looking for a Dodge hubcap, and I couldn't find one. And my collection of stuff, I had a box, of course, full of hubcaps, but the Dodge ones, unfortunately, my Dodge hubcap didn't get in that box. Okay, there's the Pierce Arrow. Beautiful car. The Pierce Arrow motorette, I think it was 1902, 1903. There is one of them around in the Twin Cities because it was at a swap meet once. And the car was called Pierce. And then they made what they called the Great Arrow. And the Great Arrow was 1906, it had an aluminum body, beautiful car, but it was called the Arrow, it was by the Pierce company, but it was the Arrow model. And people started to call the company Pierce Arrow then, and they adapted the name, Pierce Arrow. And they continued until, what I have there, 31. And it was part of the 3 Ps, Packard, Pierce Arrow, and Peerless were the three of them. And the Pierce Arrow was known, the very first Pierce Arrows up to about 12 had the headlights regular. But in, I think, about 13, they developed a front fender with the headlight in the fender. And so for years, Pierce Arrow had those headlights stuck out there on the fender. And that was the mark. You saw them coming down the road, you know it was a Pierce Arrow.
LaSalle, another one, was named after an explorer. And it was the companion to the Cadillac, a slightly cheaper model. And so you can see the years that it existed.
It was a good car. But again, you see in 26, 27, when they were planning these cars, the Marmon built the Roosevelt, and the LaSalle came in, and what is it, Studebaker had the Erskine. And there were just a number of them that came out at that time. General Motors, of course, was well off enough to keep the car during the Depression. But otherwise, they were planned and first built during the heydays of the roaring 20s. And the DeSoto, the same Chrysler product, 28 to 61. And I could have shown it when the car went out in 61. I stopped by the DeSoto dealership on Lake Street and said, "Do you have anything that I could have to keep as a souvenir?" And they gave me their dealer book. So I have the 61 DeSoto dealer book, about 1.5 inches thick, showing all the models. It's interesting. Oh, yeah,
DeSoto was
like
also
Crosby.
an explorer, and they used a ship then from Chrysler. So
Yeah.
that just is a
Yeah, you see the
coincidence.
ship up there.
Yeah,
And it says down below, Chrysler product. And the Crosley, the next one. The Crosley was made by the Crosley Refrigerator Company. And the first ones in 1939 were sold in the department store. Macy's sold them. And I think they were just a 2-cylinder. And the cars were real light. There was a 39 in Minneapolis. And a friend of mine rented a garage to put a 2021 Senador sedan in, and then there was a 17 Touring in the same garage, and a 39 Crosley. And thinking back, a person should have tried to buy it. They were a 4-cylinder after the war, and the engines were not cast. They welded together boilerplate and made an engine. As the very first ones in 46, 47. It's an unusual way to make an engine, but that's what they did. They welded them together. And a friend of mine in high school had a 48 Crosley, and we went to Washburn, and there was a big, Washburn had a big area in back between the two wings where you could go in. And they would take, one time, remember, they took his Crosley and carried it back in there and set it up on end. So he came out of school at night, and there was his Crosley sitting like this against the wall. They made the hot shot too, a little small one. I don't show a picture of the Crosley hot shot. Crosleys are quite collectible. They're interesting little cars.
And of course, if you heard of the Crosley Shelvador, well, that was the refrigerator, not the car.
Yeah. The Auburn, of course, Auburn, Indiana. The Auburn was Auburn. The stock cord was connected, owned the controlling interest in Auburn. He took over Duesenberg, I think, at 24. But in the stock market crash that Thursday in October 1929, the headlines referred to Auburn stock falls, and it fell like 30 points back when its stock was, was, I don't remember the deal, like from $60 to $30, but money was money in 29, and it was quite the loss of that. But somewhere I have that newspaper. You never know what I have, but I do have the newspaper, Minneapolis paper from the next day, talking about the stock market crash. And the headlines talk about Auburn stock. So it's interesting.
See just another illustration of how during World War II, companies adapted to build things for the war effort. So you see another little illustration.
Most all of the Jeeps built by Ford and Willis during World War II, the bodies were built by Auburn. So a Ford Jeep and a general purpose vehicle, and the Willis one had Auburn bodies. The Mercer, of course, the famous Mercer, and 1026. The auction in Detroit Lakes in 1955 or 56, a Hera came from Reno, and there was a long wheelbase Mercer chassis there, and he paid back in those days like $3,000 for it, which was money, in those days. And he built a long wheelbase Mercer raceabout on it. They built touring cars too, you can see beside the Mercer raceabout. And the Mitchell, Racine, Wisconsin. And again, I got the hubcap. I also have the plate that goes along, when you open up when the door on the car, you either open up the door or like in the 1910, you had it in front, where you step in. Well, I have the Mitchell one, but again, to get everything together for this, there's some little things that I could have included that I didn't get there. The one I wanted to do, and I didn't take the picture of it, is the Wolf car that was built by Wilcox Company in Northeast northeast Minneapolis, had on each side compartments. And on the compartments, they had a aluminum plate that said Wolf. And I had a pair of them for years. And Bob Johnson, a friend of mine, just kept bugging me that he wanted. And I figured, well, I'm not going to find a Wolf car to put them on. So Bob has it, and I had one. I was going to take a picture of it and talk about the Wolf car. And that'll have to be for another time.
Are you sure? You wanna go to the next slide? Are
Yep.
you sure?
Yeah, the next one.
Fine.
Oh, yeah, there's the thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. We had a lot of fun putting this together.
Oh,
Placing it, photo,
oh, yeah.
photographing
Good
it,
see.
and everything.